So, racism has been around for a long time, a very long time actually. It has been a very visible thing for hundreds, if not thousands of years, which is why it surprised me when I couldn't find a single review of racism. Considering that it dominates political discussion in the media, one would assume that someone has gave it an honest review. Pretty much everyone has been affected by racism, whether they know it or not. And after doing some research, the amount of reviews I found on racism, as far as I know, were zero. Racism and racists have strongly influenced and shaped the society we live in today, and even permeate the very pillars of life in our society. So, okay, I'll bite. I'm going to give racism an honest, objective review, ignoring the fact that racism does get a pretty bad rap in the media. I want to take a step back and really evaluate racism with an unbiased lens. Lift the veil, if you will, and see racism for what it's worth. We will have to look at the evolution of racism, how it has functioned through history, and how it has been defined. Nowhere better to start than 354 BC, where Aristotle, in his discussion of slavery, stated that while Greeks are free by nature, barbarians or non-Greeks are slaves by nature, that they are more inclined to submit to a despotic government where a single entity rules with absolute power. Note that Aristotle does not mention race, but is referring to anyone who is not Greek or other is inferior. So, we can conclude at this point, racism was based on where you live rather than what you look like. Granted, he did go on to say that most natural slaves are those with strong bodies. The underlying message here is that Greeks are simply superior to non-Greeks. Now, moving forward in history a bit to the 19th century, racism led the founders of a new country, America, I think they call it, to a shortcut for not doing manual labor by outsourcing to other countries. Actually, the continent of Africa to be specific. And to be efficient, they just brought them home to America and forced them to do the manual labor instead, on the basis that they had different physical traits, like dark skin, which made them inferior. We can see that racism has evolved to be not only about where one is from, but also how they look. The people who did this came from England, where some guys sat around and decided they didn't like how things were going and took things into their own hands by starting their own country and trying to make tea in the ocean as a big middle finger to the Queen. Later on, the same people from Africa who were forced to build this new free country got together and decided they didn't like how things were going, took things into their own hands, and finally didn't have to do the whole slavery thing anymore. See a pattern here? Well, let's get down to brass tacks here and really evaluate racism. We could start by looking at the positive and negative impacts racism has had. So let's make a pros and cons list. Pros. Race gives people a sense of belonging, that they're part of something bigger than themselves. So we can put down community under pros. And if you're white, the pros might look something like this. But if you're everyone else in the world, the list is much, much shorter. Okay, so I did some research and found that there actually aren't any pros for non-whites. So in the consideration of time, let's move on to cons. One article I found actually says that racism is bad for your health, and I'm sure, like myself, everyone would rather live for a longer time rather than a shorter time, so I think we can safely assume that it's a con. Racism has resulted in racial profiling, police brutality, and because of this, an unrecordable number of people have died. And non-whites, as a result, do not feel safe walking the street. And referring to my previous statement that people would rather live for a longer time than a shorter time, we can assume that police brutality is a bad thing. So we can put this in the cons column. Redlining, social stratification, unequal access to education, glass ceiling in the job market, lack of platforms to express one's opinion, riots, mass incarceration due to a skewed legal system, misrepresentations in media are all effects of racism, to name a few. So, overall, I think I stayed fairly unbiased in my assessment of racism. I gave it an honest review and an honest look, but overall, can't say I'd recommend it at all. So, if you're a country, nation state, or government thinking about implementing racism, I'd have to say I personally wouldn't do it. If you're white, I can see the positive effects, I guess, but still probably not a good call. While it certainly streamlines the work involved in building a country, the negative effects seem to far outweigh the positive from what I've been able to gather. Some alternatives to racism would be being a generally okay person. Yeah, that's really all I could find. One day, something may come up that makes me reevaluate my judgment, but for now, I'm gonna have to give racism a 0. Okay, bye.